151 Chapter 6 The Basic Categories and Laws of Dialectics 1. On the unity of and differences between the categories and laws of dialectics. Categories as stages and forms of the knowledge of the world. The world in its constant motion and development is reflected in thought that is just as dynamic. If everything develops, wrote Lenin, does not that apply also to the most general concepts and categories of thought? If not, it means that thinking is not connected with being. If it does, it means that there is a dialectics of concepts and a dialectics of cognition which has objective significance. 1. The content of categories and laws and their interrelation contains precisely this kind of dialectics of cognition. Even the simplest thought, like 3 yellow leaves fell to the ground, contains such concepts as object, leaf, the ground, quality, yellow, quantity, 3, motion, to fall. If in perceiving things we do not place them under the headings of some concepts or categories, we are doomed to mindless observation of objects. The categorial structure of thought is a necessary premise of the cognitive act. To every person starting out in life, the historically established categories are given as something a priori or pre-experiential in relation precisely to that person, although they are a posteriori or post-experiential in their origin. As they are assimilated, the categories determine the area and orientation of the vision of any form of givenness, natural, social or spiritual. They direct the substantive understanding of the world by man and of man in the world, and impart a structure to cognitive activity, determining both the field of the mentally observed reality and the angle of its interpretation. In other words, the categories are filled both with methodological and worldview content. Thus the content of the category of 1 v.I. Lenin, conspectus of Hegel's book Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Collected Works, Volume 38, pages 253–54. Being may be either materialist or idealist. This applies to all categories without exception. 152 Every science has its own historically established arsenal of logical instruments of thinking in terms of which the properties and essence of objects are perceived. Of course, any science operates with concepts of varying degree of generality and significance, but its framework is made up of the fundamental concepts. Taken as a system, they form what is known as the categorial structure of a given domain. The categories of philosophy are general concepts reflecting the most essential, law-governed connections and relationships of reality. They are stages of distinguishing, i.e. of cognizing the world, focal points in the web, which assist in cognizing and mastering it. 2 Philosophical categories reproduce the properties and relations of existence in global form. But, just as in any other science, not all philosophical categories are universal. For example, epistemological categories like knowledge, truth, or error describe some essential aspects of cognitive activity only. There are, however, universal philosophical categories as well. These regulate the real process of thinking and gradually form a separate system in the course of its historical development. Here belong such categories as connection, interaction, reflection, information, development, causality, structure, system, form, content, essence, phenomenon, etc. In all the transformations of both concrete scientific and philosophical knowledge, it is the system of categories that proves the most stable element, although it, too, undergoes definite changes, being subject to the principle of development. Our present-day notions of the content of such fundamental categories as matter or consciousness differ significantly from their perception, say, in the philosophy of the early modern times, and even more from that of antiquity. Characteristic of philosophical categories is the fact that, accumulating, as it were, the results of the development of the specialized sciences, they embody the worldview and methodological elements in scientific thought. The categories of philosophy are interconnected in such a way that each of them can only be perceived as an element of the overall system. Thus the material and spiritual reality cannot be understood in terms of the category 2 vi Lenin, conspectus of Hegel's book The Science of Logic, Collected Works, Volume 38, p. 93. Of matter only, without recourse to the categories of motion, development, space, time, and many others. Otherwise we would be unable to go beyond a mere statement of reality in its totality. What we have to do is employ the entire system of philosophical categories and concepts in which one element is characterized in terms of others, in unity with the others, now merging in one whole, now splitting apart. 153 The order of philosophical categories in the system is based on the growing complexity of objective connections and a movement of knowledge from the simple to the complex. For a deeper consideration of a given problem, a person has every right to select a certain unit of the categorical system, bearing in mind at the same time that the system of philosophical categories is an organic whole in which no link can be separated from the rest without damage to true knowledge. The relationship between the categories and the basic laws of dialectics. It should be stated from the outset that the basic laws of dialectics implement the links between an interaction of the categories. Moreover, they are themselves expanded categories. Even the concept of law is a category. All that is on the one hand, and on the other, some categories are in themselves also laws. Thus the category of causality is a universal law of the world. In this case, the law category expresses in effect a fundamental philosophical principle. Reflecting as they do the objective dialectics of reality, the categories and laws of dialectics, cognized by man, act as a universal method of the cognition and transformation of reality. As the history of knowledge begins with the identification of some general element in nature in keeping with the abstraction-forming activity of thinking, knowledge is at first molded as general concepts and categories which form the basis for certain principles of both being and thinking itself. Subsequently, cognizing thought endeavors to formulate, with the aid of well-developed instruments of cognition, the categories and principles, and on the basis of an increasingly varied empirical data, fundamental propositions introducing order into our knowledge of the world, propositions known as laws. Our presentation of the categories and laws of dialectics is determined by this historically evolved course of knowledge. 2. Essence and phenomenon. The concepts of essence and phenomenon. 154 The development of knowledge is a constant movement of thought from the superficial and observable, from that which appears to us, towards that which is deep-lying and hidden, towards essence. Essence assumes true reality only through definite forms of self-manifestation. For example, just as leaves, flowers, branches and fruits express in their outward appearance the essence of plants, so do ethical, political, philosophical, scientific, and aesthetic ideas express the essence of a definite social system. The essential nature of a social system determines the features it manifests in politics, in the modes of expression of the people's will, In the forms of justice, in the character of labor, in artistic creativity, etc. A phenomenon conveys as a rule only one facet or aspect of essence. To take an example, many symptoms of malignant growths or cancer have been studied in sufficient detail, but the essence of it still remains a sinister secret. Essence is concealed from the human eye, while phenomenon lies on the surface. Essence is therefore something hidden, something deep lying concealed in things and their inner connections, something that controls things. It is the basis of all the forms of their external manifestation. Essence is conceived both on a global scale, as the ultimate foundation of the universe, and in the limits of definite classes of all that is, for example, minerals, plants, animals, or man. The very concept of essence is comprehensive and cumulative. It contains the integral unity of all the most profound, fundamentally connected elements of the content of an object in their cause and effect relations, in their inception, development, and tendencies of future evolution. It contains the cause and the law, the principal contradictions and the structure, and that which determines all the properties of the object. Essence is in this sense something internal, a certain organizing principle of the object's existence in the forms of its external expression. The concept of essence is correlative with all the categories, in particular with the concept of content, though it expresses the principal part of the content rather than content as a whole. It is also correlative with the category of quality, but the latter does not exhaust essence, expressing some one aspect of it only. To bring out an essence, one must also identify measure as a unity of quality and quantity. It is correlative with the concept of law, but law and essence do not coincide. We know the laws of gravitation although we are still ignorant of its physical essence. And who can say what the deep essence of information is? And this is despite the fact that the laws of reception, storing, and processing of information have been studied quite thoroughly. To bring out the essence of something means to penetrate into the core of a thing, into its basic properties. It means to establish the cause of its emergence and the laws of its functioning, as well as the tendencies of development. Essence varies in depth both on the epistemological and on the ontological plane. It thus has its degrees or order. Knowledge always moves from an essence of one order to an essence of another, deeper order. Beginning with a relatively simple essence, the order of essences ascends into infinity. Its nebulous depths are only grasped by the power of the mind in potentia, while in actuality the mind always remains in the abyss of ongoing being. What contemporary science knows of essence is only a definite order, one in a series, of its manifestness to mankind's collective reason. Assuming that the universe is infinite, the orders of essence may be said to be unlimited. That is why when we say that we have grasped the essence, it is mostly a metaphor implying that we have merely caught at the edge of essence in its full extent. It should also be stressed that essence is always concrete, there are no essences in general. 155 In reality, essence is inextricably connected with the forms of its manifestation. The surplus value appropriated by the capitalist manifests itself in the form of profit. No one can perceive it outside this form. What is phenomenon? Phenomenon is a manifestation of essence. If essence is something general, phenomenon is something individual, expressing only one element of essence. If essence is something profound, phenomenon is external, richer and more colorful. If essence is something stable and necessary, phenomenon is transient, changeable, and accidental. In a word, Phenomenon is the way in which essence outwardly manifests itself in interaction with all that is not essence, including our sense organs. Philosophical controversy on the dialectics of essence and phenomenon. Before Kant, the dialectics of essence and phenomenon was practically identified with the idea-matter relationship. Early philosophers already saw essence as the foundation of all things in the world, as the source and starting point of all concrete diversity. According to Plato, essence is identical with idea, or eidos, and irreducible to the corporeal, sensually perceived forms of being. It is a certain primordial model of all that emerges and is. According to Aristotle, the essence of a thing is form endowed with a certain activeness, a principle animating inert matter in combination with which all things are formed. The famous argument between the realists and the nominalists on the form of the existence of general concepts or universals marked the beginning of the separation of the categories of essence and phenomenon from those of idea and matter. In the nominalists' view, only individual things, a partial analogue of phenomenon, had real existence, while the general, or the essence, was declared to be a result of the mental process of generalization of individual things. 156. For the realists, on the contrary, the general had existence, either regardless of individual things or phenomena, and that was a step towards idealism, or as their inner element. Kant made the problem even more acute when he introduced the concept of thing in itself, or essence, which he purported to prove to be incognizable and opposed to the phenomena of the objective world proper, accessible to sense perception but concealing their true essence from the human mind. Kant finally separated the problem of essence and phenomenon from that of idea, spirit, and matter. Since Kant, essence has been thought of as the object's qualitative specifics independent of the features of the subject and concealed from direct observation in view of the conventional nature of reflection mechanisms characteristic of the human sense organs and thinking. In order to get access to the world of essences, man must learn to decode the world of phenomena given him in his sensations. Phenomenon covers the directly observable properties of an object whose vision depends on the structure and functioning of the knowing subject's sense organs, while essence is the object's qualitative specificity determining its image, one that may be concealed behind the directly observed manifestations requiring adequate interpretation. Thus the green color of grass is its property at the level of phenomena, while the essential characteristic of grass is its objective physical ability to reflect the rays of light in such a way that the human eye perceives grass precisely as green. In accordance with the same objectively essential specificity of reflection of light rays, grass is seen not as green but, say, as gray, to use a conventional designation, by a dog, as animals have a differently constructed visual apparatus. Both essence and phenomenon exist objectively, both are attributes of the object, but phenomenon is a function of two magnitudes, object and its givenness to subject, whereas essence is the object's properly objective quality. This dependence of phenomenon on the properties of the subject himself is reflected in the theory of relativity in quantum physics, where the observer's position and the state of apparatus at the start of the experiment are taken into account in the givens of the experiment and even in the mathematical formulas reflecting physical laws. When the problem of essence and phenomenon was separated from that of spirit and matter, the philosophical controversy around these categories did not cease, but its content was now different. 157. Having finally set apart the categories of essence and phenomenon, Kant raised this issue: can the human mind break through the screen of phenomena to the object's essence? In other words, how can man cognize the objective world? Different solutions of this question were offered. Thus Hegel recognized the possibility of knowing the essence, which he saw as an expression of the absolute idea generating the world of phenomena in the process of its self-development. Agnostics, on the contrary, regarded the world as unknowable, taking Kant's opposition of essence and phenomenon to be an absolute, and thereby ignoring the objective link between phenomenon and essence. The solution of this question thus turns on the dialectics of essence and phenomenon. The view of essence as knowable entails the interpretation of phenomenon not only as a consequence of the subject's properties but also as a consequence or manifestation of the essence itself. In our example, the color of grass, or the perception of its specific color spectrum, depends on the structure of the eye, but the fact itself that the physical nature of the reflection of light rays can be expressed in physical magnitudes depends on the object's essence. The fact that we see grass as something green depends on the structure of our eye, but the very fact that we see grass, which would be impossible in the case of, say, microcosmic objects, and, most importantly, that we see not only green grass but also blue skies, brown earth, and various shades of green in the plant world, all this enables us to identify a common basis in all visible things, and to penetrate into the objective physical essence of light processes. The physical nature of color formation has been sufficiently studied by science, which can even identify the chemical composition of stars from their color. In the system of dialectical materialism, the categories of essence and phenomenon are regarded as universal objective characteristics of object reality. The unity of these categories signifies the unity of ontology and epistemology, i.e., the unity of the world and of thinking about the world. Essence and phenomenon emerge as different stages in the process of cognition. Man approximates to the essence of phenomena through praxis, experiment, the mind's abstraction-forming activity revealing the objective nature of these phenomena, but he never exhausts this essence entirely. Such is the dialectics of essence and phenomenon. Ignoring this dialectics entails a great many mistakes. The history of human thought shows that the most widespread type of such errors were the various modifications of empiricism, which endeavored in every way to reduce problems to phenomena only, without clarification of their deep essence. Thus neopositivists today reject essences, declaring them to be metaphysical inventions and believing their only task to be accumulation, classification and systematization of facts. They declare this position to be the only scientific one, free from the fetters of abstract confused reason. The difficulty is, however, that criteria for the classification of facts are impossible to identify without an initial theory, if only of a very general nature. Blind empiricism is just as helpless as empty theorizing. It was no accident that for a long time physicists felt helpless to classify certain contradictory facts, until the concept of a new essence combining wave and quantum properties was introduced, and quantum physics was thus founded. 158. The dialectics of essence and phenomenon is questioned not only by empirically minded natural scientists but also by some scholars. Thus phenomenologists doubt if it is necessary to distinguish in each person his or her generic essence while ignoring the individual qualities which are, after all, the most valuable elements about us. They are right here. It is true that individuality is the most valuable thing about a person, but it is not true that individuality is merely a phenomenon and not essence. The meaning of history lies precisely in the fact that each human being's personal, particular qualities are not accidental and individual in this sense, but essential. It is clear from this that the question of the relationship between essence and phenomenon, on the one hand, and the concept of the individual, on the other, is particularly acute in the humanities. But the natural and quite justifiable fear of spiritual uniformity must not lead to rejection of essence. The individual is also essential. Thus Shakespeare and Dostoevsky are unique, and they occupy a special essential place in the history of culture. Neglect for the essential value and uniqueness of the creative individuality can open the way to a flow of dull and faceless literary productions, but the essential and the personal merge into a single whole in man. Personality is an essential human quality manifested in people differing widely in type and character. The dialectics of essence and phenomenon is by no means a simple process. One essence, one and only one phenomenon is not the type of relationship it is characterized by. In itself, a phenomenon is fairly indeterminate, and it does not always conceal a true essence. If the relationship were always simple, true and unambiguous, human knowledge would not abound in errors and delusions. So the problem of appearance proves quite real in philosophy. 159 To be and to appear. We encounter the relations of being and appearing more often than we think. We must have all had occasion to see from our personal experience that, sitting in a train passed by another train, it is difficult to say whether we are in motion or not. Although the difficulty is simply overcome, all we have to do is look the other way. Or consider another example. We have all seen myriads of stars on a clear night. We have enjoyed their sight and dreamed of the higher things, little concerned with the fact that there are no stars where we see them. They have gone at dizzying speeds into the infinite distances of the universe where we cannot see them at all. It is thus clear that the mass of stars that we see is merely a seeming mass, and the true being in the skies is quite different. True, we cannot say in this case that appearances are deceptive. After all, we are dealing with the real phenomenon which only assumes the guise of appearance. In this case, appearance is not a delusive product of our organs of sense. It emerges under real relations. Thus mirages in deserts are natural phenomena rather than visual phantoms. They can even be photographed, being the consequence of the refraction of light rays in the atmosphere. Appearance therefore has a basis in essence, it is essence in one of its manifestations. Since the manifestations of appearance are varied, a critical verification of direct observation data and a clear distinction between being and appearing are necessary for a correct understanding of an event. The phenomenon of being and appearing expresses above all the discrepancy between essence and its external manifestation. This discrepancy often reaches the stage of direct opposition, and it then figures as a distorting mirror of essence. Man's self-expression may be essence-related or appearance-related. A person is not always what he is trying to seem. For many, it is much easier to seem to be good and just than to be such. Some persons have this weakness that they are concerned with seeming much better than they really are. The passion for showing off, for constant substitution of appearance for essence in the end completely distorts the personality, and what once was appearance becomes essence. It becomes a character trait determining from within the relationships between the given person and the people around him. Is a person's every action an adequate form of the self-realization of his personality essence? The answer is yes and no. You may say that a certain person is highly irresponsible, and his thoughtless action was accidental, quite uncharacteristic. One may accept this, yet there was something lacking in that man's sense of responsibility and something that permitted that thoughtless action, something that made precisely that action possible in principle. It follows that what appears expresses in this case a feature of what is. 160. We can thus say that phenomenon manifests essence while appearance as a rule conceals it, and the task is to penetrate beyond the screen of appearance and peer at the true face of essence. To achieve this, one must not accept the external as the internal on trust but persistently move from the external to the internal. Phenomenon and essence, the external and the internal. Cognition always proceeds from the external to the internal, from the observable to the unobservable. In Marxist epistemology, the categories of the external and the internal stress the systemic and integral character of the objects under study. Here, they are partly correlated with the categories of content and form. From this standpoint, the category of the external reveals the properties of the object as a whole, and not only of the object in itself but also of its mode of interaction with the environment. As for the category of the internal, it reveals in the process of cognition the structure of the object, and is only identified through theoretical procedures of cognition involving assumptions about idealized objects, formulation of laws, etc. While the internal can only be understood through the external, the true nature of the external, in its turn, can only be grasped if the internal is understood. The categories of the internal and the external considered in terms of a systemic description of objects are therefore directly linked with a dialectical understanding of development, figuring as necessarily interconnected elements of being in its development. In the context of the present discourse, the impression may be created that the concepts of the external and the internal are synonymous with those of essence and phenomenon. But is that really so? In the history of knowledge, the problem of the internal and the external was often linked up with that of essence and phenomenon interpreted as characteristics of being. However, there is no complete identity here, leading to the so-called doubling of terms. Indeed, even if we grasp the object's inner structure, its elements and composition, we shall have no right to say that we have grasped its essence. The fact is that the latter assumes knowledge of certain principles of its development and functioning. It excludes the presence of anything accidental and inessential. But the inner content of a given object has, among others, accidental and inessential elements. Furthermore, a phenomenon does not, as a rule, tell us anything of the object's links with other objects, while the concept of the external assumes that the object is considered precisely in terms of its links, so that the external becomes essential for the object. In this sense, the external reveals the object's essential links, bringing out a certain aspect of its essence. 161. The categories of essence and phenomenon are the focal pair of categories in dialectics. It throws light on the outlines of other categories, for which it serves as a kind of categorical pivot. 3. The individual, the particular and the general. The concepts of the individual and the general. An infinite variety of things exists in the world. All things and events differ from one another, they are individual in their being. Although human beings are sometimes described by the expression as like as two peas, science knows that genes contain unique and always individual information, which proves that no two identical human beings can be found. An infinite number of specific conditions and a mass of accidentals contribute to the fashioning of the individual. Thus the differences between any two maple leaves are conditioned by differences in lighting, nourishment, temperature, energy, microclimate, all determining their size, color shades, form and weight. Nature is inexhaustible in creating the individual, it brooks no clichés. The individual is an object differing from other objects in its unique specifics. Not only single objects but classes of objects, too, may be regarded as individual, if the class is taken as something integral. The same applies to a single feature of an object considered in its individual uniqueness. The individual is thus a category expressing the relative isolation, discreteness, delimitedness of one object from another in space and time, the intrinsic peculiarities that make up an object's unique qualitative and quantitative definiteness. However, infinite diversity is only one aspect of being. The other aspect is the universality of things, their structures, properties and relations. Just as firmly as we stated that there are no two absolutely identical things, we can also say that neither are there two absolutely different things. The notion of the world only as an infinite diversity of individualities is one-sided and therefore false. It cannot be doubted that, although all human beings are individual, we have no difficulty in identifying the generic essence inherent in all of them and expressed in the general concept of man. The general is the singular and the many. It expresses definite properties or relations characteristic of the given class of objects or events. As a similarity of the features of things, the general is accessible to direct perception. Being a law, it is reflected in the form of concepts and theories. Although a law comprises the concept of the general and is formed on its basis, the converse assertion that the general is a law is false. The general helps us to approximate to the essence of things, but it must not be confused with essence itself. Characterizing a sufficiently high degree of distribution of a quality or property, the general is not correlated with the object's entire essence as a certain systemically organized whole but only with some one attribute of that whole. It should also be borne in mind that an object's general features may be both essential and inessential. The external features of objects are, as a rule, inessential. For example, man is the only creature in the world that has a soft earlobe. Only man, and no one else, has this feature, and yet it is not essential for him, it does not express his human essence. 162 The categories of the individual and the general have a profound worldview and methodological significance. A characteristic trait of objective idealism is separation of the general from the individual, the raising of the general to an absolute and its treatment as something which precedes the individual and creates it. Plato, Hegel. On the other hand, the view of reality as a mass of individualities independent of one another is characteristic of narrow empiricism, which regards the individual as a basic category, and the general as a mere derivative abstraction. Underlying the medieval controversy between the nominalists and the realists was the same tendency to separate and oppose to one another the individual and the general. A sharp contradistinction between the individual and the general in various systems of idealism is linked with an antithesis, just as sharp, between the categories of essence and phenomenon. In objective idealist systems, the general is identified with essence. In systems of subjective idealism, on the contrary, the individual, identified with phenomenon, assumes the form of essence, and essence is thus identified with phenomenon, it is reduced to mere existence. Dialectical materialism insists on the objectiveness and unity of the individual and the general. So wherein lies their dialectics? The dialectics of the individual and the general. Instead of dry theorizing, let us start with the concrete. We know that information recorded in molecular structures of the cellular nucleus constitutes a general program in accordance with which the individual organism develops, and hereditary properties are passed on from one generation to another. Man's generic essence in the groundwork of heredity is transmitted from generation to generation, and in unity with all the natural and social conditions creates individuality. On this groundwork, common to all descendants, each of them builds his own special and unique pattern. The individual is dominated by the general, which ruthlessly forces the individual to perish, one after another, as something transient. In the name of preserving the general as something stable, the individual dies, but the species lives on. 163. But why is the general intrinsically tied to the individual? The simple reason is that, because of the discreteness of the world, the general does not exist, and is not given to us, other than through the individual. They are not things juxtaposed to one another, and the dialectics does not consist here in the fact that the one exists and the other exists and the two somehow interact, but in an object existing and manifesting itself as existing, in one way or another, owing to the material unity of the world, its energy and formation interactions, and the universality of the principal attributes of all that is. The general therefore does not exist separately but as a law of the birth and life of the individual. It contains in itself the law governing the processes going on in any individual phenomenon of the given class. The action of the law, the anonymous power of the general, is expressed only in the individual and through the individual. Just as the individual is impossible without the general, so is the general impossible without the individual, which serves as the premise and the substratum of the general. If we recognize, however, that the dialectics of the individual and the general is universal and the general is manifested only in the individual, that means that all of the existing individualities are indistinguishable. It has been said above, though, and it is an empirically observable fact, that there are no two absolutely identical things, and they are distinguishable in some aspects even when there is nearly complete similarity. This difference in individualities is embodied in the category of the particular. The particular signifies the measure and mode of combining the general and the individual in a single phenomenon. It is conceived as the specificity of the realization of the general, a specificity characteristic of the given object. No cognitive or practical activity is possible without correct account being taken of the dialectics of the individual, the particular and the general. To understand separate phenomena, it is necessary 164 to extract them from the general connectedness and to consider them analytically. Science deals above all with generalizations and operates with general concepts, which enables it to establish laws and thus arm practice with predictions. Practical success, however, does not merely require knowledge of the general but also a full account of the individual and the particular. Creative thought permits of no clichés that would be applicable everywhere without regard for the individual peculiarities. The particular is richer than the general. Of course, when we define the average velocity of gas molecules, we are not interested in the behavior of each separate molecule. Their impersonality does not discourage anyone. In medicine, Though, the situation is quite different. The doctor must treat not just man in general but a concrete person with unique individual features that are highly important for the matter in hand. One and the same disease in different patients will require certain modifications in the general method of treatment. Two paths are possible in the cognition of that which exists. One is through abstraction from the individual and the accidental towards the formation of general concepts and theories reflecting the essential, and the other is the opposite way, through finding the most characteristic individual events which, despite all their uniqueness, directly, as it were, represent the general and law-governed. These are typical individualities. Thus the dialectics of the individual, the general and the particular helps us to understand better the essence of natural and social phenomena, as well as the principles of activity and of cognizing thought. But it only achieves these goals when it is concretized in the necessary and the accidental. 4. Necessity and chance. The concepts of the necessary and the accidental. Historically, the categories of necessity and chance emerged as a consequence of meditation on the human fate, on divine providence, the freedom of the will, on the predestination or spontaneous character of human being. These categories became free of this primarily ethical interpretation mostly in connection with the achievements of natural scientific knowledge in the modern times. After a fairly long epoch of the dominance of Laplacian determinism and other forms of metaphysics, during which the various interpretations of necessity were in fact predominant, further development of the exact sciences, in particular of the probability theory, gave a new impetus to a deeper understanding of the categories of necessity and chance. These categories acquired a dialectical flexibility in the philosophy of Hegel, and were given consistent scientific substantiation in dialectical materialism. Now, what is the meaning of these categories? 165. Can something that exists be non-existent, and could something have happened that did not in fact happen? Which of us never thought about such questions as whether it was necessity or chance that precisely Napoleon became the head of the French state? Was it an accidental or a law-governed event that America was discovered, and that it was precisely Columbus who discovered it? Was it accidental or by law that life sprang up on earth, and then human beings, and then you, my reader? Such questions may be asked ad infinitum. These questions were variously answered by different thinkers. Whatever happens in nature or in the life of society or individual, fatalistically minded people usually say, what will be, will be. This view is based on the assumption that everything in the world and in the life of each individual is predetermined either by destiny, as in antiquity, or by God, as in Christianity, or by the entire system of interaction of phenomena. From the positions of determinism, which is traced back to Democritus, chance is seen as a purely subjective concept with which we designate something of which the causes we do not yet know. As soon as man discovers the cause of a phenomenon, it ceases to be accidental. What we have here is a substitution of one term for another. The point is that the chance of which the cause has been cognized does not cease to be chance by virtue of the fact of cognition. The existence of a cause is not necessarily connected with necessity. It is true that there are no phenomena without a cause. All accidental phenomena are causally conditioned, in one way or another, but that does not make them necessary at all. In its most refined form, Fatalism is formulated in the system of Laplacian determinism, asserting that a single mathematical formula can express all the parameters characterizing an instantaneous state of all the parts of nature and of the forces animating nature, as well as all the world's past states, and predict all events in the times to come. In the dialectical world, however, many phenomena take place which cannot be predicted even with the help of a fantastic number of equations and a hypothetical all-embracing mind, for a significant role in this world is played by chance. There were also those who believed that everything on this earth is a matter of chance, to which our fate should be entrusted. That was the origin of the false alternative that has confused the minds of men for thousands of years: either the world is dominated by chance alone, and there is no place for necessity, or else there is no chance at all, and then everything takes place out of necessity. In actual fact, though, a great many things occur in this world accidentally. Chance has its share of right to existence. 166. Now, what is chance? Chance is a type of connection which is conditioned by an essential, external, and contingent, in relation to the given phenomenon, causes. As a rule, such a connection is unstable. In other words, chance is the subjectively unexpected, objectively unnecessary event which may or may not occur under given conditions, which may take any course in its development. Chance may be external or internal. External chance is beyond the power of a given necessity, and it is governed by some attendant circumstances. Say, a person has stepped on a watermelon rind and fallen. We see the cause of the fall, but it is not at all dictated by the logic of the victim's actions. Blind chance has suddenly interfered. Internal chance follows from the object's nature. It is, as it were, a turbulence caused by necessity. Chance is regarded as internal if the situation of the birth of an accidental phenomenon is described from within a single causal series, while the total action of other causal sequences is described in terms of the objective conditions of the realization of the main causal series. Chance is also divided into subjective, that is, emerging from a display of the freedom of the will by an individual acting against objective necessity, such is the nature of the historical voluntarism of some political figures, and objective. This will be considered in our treatment of the category of probability. Rejection of objective chance is false and harmful both from the scientific and practical viewpoints. Seeing everything as equally necessary, man proves to be incapable of separating the essential from the inessential, the necessary from the accidental. This view reduces necessity itself to the level of chance. Putting it briefly, the accidental is the possible under suitable conditions. It is opposed to the law governed as the necessary in a definite situation. Necessity is a law-governed type of links between phenomena determined by their stable inner basis and by an ensemble of the essential conditions of their emergence, existence and development. Necessity is an element of law, and in this sense a synonym of law. Inasmuch as law expresses the general and the essential in phenomena, necessity is inseparable from essence. If the cause of the accidental lies somewhere else, in the intersection of different series of cause and effect connections, the cause of the necessary lies in itself. 167. Just as chance, necessity may be external and internal, i.e. produced by the object's own nature or under the contingency. It may be characteristic of a great number of objects or of a single object. Necessity is an essential feature of law. Just as law, It may be dynamic or statistical. Necessity and chance figure as two correlative categories expressing the philosophical interpretation of the interdependence between phenomena, the degree of the determination of their emergence and existence. The necessary forces its way through the accidental. Chance introduces an element of indeterminacy into regularly occurring processes, which is expressed in the category of probability. Why is necessity capable of being manifested through chance? Because it is realized only through the individual. In this sense, chance is correlative with individuality. Accidents affect the course of a necessary process. They either accelerate it or slow it down. Moreover, in the course of development, accidents may become necessity. Thus, regular features of a given biological species originally emerged as accidental deviations from the traits of another species. Accidents of this kind give a new life and a new perspective to necessity. According to Darwin's theory, insignificant accidental changes of organisms that are useful for these organisms are fixed in heredity mechanisms, reinforced in the course of the evolution, and lead to changes in the species. So chance is linked to necessity by diverse ties, and the boundary between chance and necessity is never closed. But the principal direction of development is determined by necessity. There is therefore only one answer to the question whether it was chance or necessity that precisely Napoleon became the head of the French state, that America was discovered, and that it was precisely Columbus who discovered it. The fact that the inner logic of the events in France demanded a personality like Napoleon was necessity, but it was pure chance that such a personality was Napoleon rather than some person named, say, Pierre. The same applies to the discovery of America. The principal goal of cognition is discovery of the law governed. We perceive the world as an infinite diversity of things and events, of colors and sounds, and of other properties and relations. But, to understand it, a definite order has to be brought to light. For this, we must analyze the concrete forms of chance in which the necessary is manifested. As for predictions of, say, social events, they assume the taking into account of both. Consider history. Is everything rational in it? Is Hegel's dictum, what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational, true? Of course not. Just as in the behavior of individuals, there is a great deal in history that is irrational. In any case, the law governed and the accidental and historical events and in people's individual acts contain elements of wisdom and folly in various proportions. 168 Necessity and Freedom. The history of society develops by virtue of its inherent necessity. Chance, however, is manifested here to a greater extent than in nature, since human beings are motivated by ideas, will and passions. This logic of history and the action of necessity as the resultant of the free activity of multitudes of people was called by Hegel the cunning of historical reason. Outside of chance, history would be extremely mystic in character, everything would be fatally predetermined beforehand. But that does not mean that the role of chance and of unlimited freedom of the will must be raised to an absolute in history, as is observed in voluntaristic conceptions. Voluntarism is the view that raises to an absolute the freedom of the will as not determined by anything, as ignoring objective conditions and laws, and bringing manifestations of freedom to the point of total arbitrariness. While voluntarism lifts the inner aspect of freedom to the point of arbitrariness, Fatalism regards each human act as an inevitable realization of some initial predestination, excluding any free choice. However, the view of man as an active creative being rules out a purely mechanistic interpretation of absolute dependence of his actions on external circumstances as accepted, say, by Hobbes or Holbach. They asserted that our life is an orbit along which we must follow due to an implacable concatenation of external forces, without being able to depart from that orbit by as much as an inch. If man acted under the impact of external forces only, his lot would inevitably be that of Buridan's ass which, having no objective grounds for choosing one out of two absolutely identical piles of hay, failed to choose either and died of hunger. This interpretation of the freedom of the will, or rather of a lack of such freedom, degrading man as an active and creatively self-determined personality, relieves him of responsibility for any act, including a criminal one, on the one hand, and on the other, makes it impossible to appreciate his merits. If everything is predetermined, wherein lies the guilt of sinners and the merit of righteous men? This is a profound moral problem that has tormented thinking mankind for ages. As a rule, adherents of the fatalistic view of the freedom of the will confuse predestination with determination, interpreting the latter in the sense of the former. In reality, all man's actions are determined, but there is nothing predestined about them. 169. The metaphysical position makes it impossible to overcome the artificial opposition of the subject of freedom to the objective conditions of his activity. Marxism proceeds from the assumption that through his activity the subject participates in the determination of events. The law-governed course of historical events is realized through people's will and conscious actions rather than outside them. A correct understanding of determination rules out a purely mechanical, one-sided dependence of man's actions on external influences upon him. This dependence is mediated by man's nature, his total experience, interests, and character of value orientations. What is, generally speaking, the freedom of the will? The freedom of the will is man's ability to take decisions and perform actions in accordance with his interests, goals, evaluations and ideals, expressed in his selective activity based on his knowledge of the objective properties and relations of things, law-governed links between phenomena and events of the objective world. Each of man's free actions is a fusion of freedom and necessity. It follows from this that the freedom of an individual, a collective, a class or society as a whole does not consist in an illusory independence from objective laws but in the ability to choose or take decisions on the basis of a sound knowledge of the circumstances. The freedom of the will is a necessary condition of any goal-directed conscious activity whose subject is inherently endowed with a sense of responsibility. Responsibility assumes, on the one hand, an awareness of what must be, and on the other, the possibility of a free choice of the ways of its realization. Further, that means that freedom is not abstract but historically concrete and relative. According to Engels, freedom is man's generic feature and the product of historical development. The first men who separated themselves from the animal kingdom were in all essentials as unfree as the animals themselves, but each step forward in the field of culture was a step towards freedom. 3. Freedom is a specifically human mode of existence. The measure of freedom as man's creative self-realization is determined by the level of development of productive forces and social relations, and also by the degree of knowledge and mastery of natural and social laws. The extent of human freedom has become a measure of social progress, while progress itself depends on the degree of freedom people have in their activity. The individual as such commands a certain measure of real freedom manifested in the freedom of choice out of the series of possibilities offered by society. The measure of citizens' freedom characterizes both the level of society's development and its moral health. 170 A retrospective view of the history of society shows that its progress is accompanied by a steady growth in the scope of individual freedom and, as a consequence, of the freedom of society as a whole, for the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. For so how is freedom correlated with necessity? The dialectics of freedom and necessity in history is such that, on the one hand, freedom is present in necessity, i.e. necessity is realized only through freedom in the form of an endless chain of people's free choices which, having once begun, has led to the given social state. That means that necessity is not only realized but also created in the historical process. On the other hand, necessity itself is contained in freedom in the form of objectively given historical circumstances, of the objective conditions of people's activity. In this sense, freedom is a recognized necessity, but this recognition means not just knowledge but also an ability to apply that knowledge in practice, contributing thereby to the overall progressive direction of the historical process. The practical realization of historical necessity is possible on the basis of its scientific philosophical knowledge. Society today is called upon to ensure the objective conditions for the achievement of people's real freedom. Freedom is the basis of a humane society, it is the inmost meaning of society as such. Society and its members must not be mutually alienated. Society 3 F. Engels, Anti-Dühring, in, K. Marx, F. Engels, Collected Works, Volume 25, p. 106. 4 K. Marx and F. Engels, Manifesto of the Communist Party, in, K. Marx, F. Engels, Collected Works, Volume 6, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1976, p. 506. Must not appear as a force external in relation to its members and oppressing them, which is characteristic of closed social systems that cannot stand the fresh wind of freedom. An expression of such alienated societies is a system of bureaucracy. It is a wasting disease which destroys freedom and distorts the individual. To bring the identification of the law-governed and the accidental, of the free and the necessary as close as possible to concrete practice for the purpose of predicting the future, to make it free of subjective evaluations, it is essential to use such an important pair of dialectical categories as possibility and reality, for necessity, chance and freedom are different modes of the transformation of the possible into the real. Man realizing his freedom to the extent of his possibilities. 171.5 Possibility, reality and probability. The concepts of possibility and reality. Reality is recorded by everyday consciousness as something existing at the given moment, i.e. in the present. And the present is interpreted as the real, as something that exists, rather than as something that is only becoming, that is in the process or on the path from the possible to the real. The possible is in this case placed somewhere outside the present and, consequently, outside the real. It does not, as it were, exist really, it is only conceived. At the level of everyday consciousness such an understanding of the possible and the real may be quite sufficient, without doubt. But the scientific or philosophical consciousness does not wish to be satisfied by this level of understanding. The real is much broader than simply the present, than the naked factuality of being. Reality is not only that which has become or is, which has taken place, but also that which is contained in what exists as a possibility of its transformation into something different. Reality is therefore loaded, as it were, not only with the present but also with the past, having realized the past possibilities. However, it is even more loaded with the future, with those diverse processes of unfolding the countless potentialities of what exists without which life, motion, development are in general impossible. In other words, the real is the unity of the possible and the actual, of that which has become and that which is becoming and, consequently, of that which is dying. With the aid of the categories of the possible and the real, thought comprehends the fact that matter is active, that it continually acquires more and more new forms of existence, passing from one form or state into others, and that it conceals an infinite number of different potentials. Possibility is not so much a special property of the non-existent, it is not so much the conceivable as a reality existing in a particular way. Being in possibility is not a fictitious or false being but an independent and extremely important sphere of reality. Its storeroom contains everything that is fated to happen as well as everything that will never happen, and this lends the present a special meaning which does not at all follow from its naked factuality. Possibility is the future in the present, something which does not exist as a given qualitative definiteness but which may appear and exist, which may become a reality under definite conditions. 172 The material world is like an endless field planted with the seeds of different possibilities which are not brought from the outside by some external forces but come into being and exist in the field itself, expressing the self-motion and self-development of reality. The category of the real thus covers and embraces all the possibilities, since the latter have no other place to be except in reality. Stressing the unity of possibility and reality, the incorporation of the former in the latter, we must, however, bear in mind that they are not just different but even antithetical. The possibility of something is far from being factual reality, and it may well happen that it will never be such. It is a beginning which includes a program of that which does not yet exist embedded in something which already exists. Thus a seed is a kind of focus of a plant, its information concentrate, but no one takes a seed for a plant, no one sits down in the shade of an acorn, although the latter contains more than a whole oak, it contains a series of past oaks and a series of future ones. 5 The category of possibility expresses the fact that the existence of a phenomenon has begun but has not yet acquired an accomplished form, that it is causally conditioned but has not yet received real implementation. 5 A. I. Harrison, Collected Works in 30 Volumes, Volume 3, Moscow, 1954, p. 124, in Russian. Reality in the broad dialectical sense covers the possible, the process of creating the new, and its being, i.e. the creative sum total of the action of all the real forces of the world. It is nature and world history, man and his reason, material and non-material culture, the unity of essence and phenomenon, of the internal and the external, of the necessary and the accidental, of the individual and the general, of cause and effect, of the potentials, of what is becoming and what has become. It is the whole world surrounding us, in all its colorful diversity. To the extent to which it has been consciously interpreted by man, reality is expressed in the total system of concepts, ideas, and images of science, philosophy and culture as a whole, a system equally reflecting both the factually real and the possible. In the narrow categorical sense related only to the mutual opposition between the real and the possible, the real is interpreted as a realized possibility, something which has directly become, something living and active. In relation to the possible as potential, the real is a realized possibility and the basis for the forms of existence of new possibilities. It follows that reality is immeasurably richer than possibility, since it embraces not only all kinds and stages of its realization, but also all the results of the process. 173 Possibility is a tendency or rather latent tendencies of the development of existing reality. If reality is the past in the present, possibility is the future in the present. Reality is the world of realized possibilities and the world of potential possibilities, and between them lies the process of the transformation of potentialities into actual reality. In terms of time, possibility precedes reality, which, being a result of development, is at the same time its starting point. Development is therefore both a process of realization and of inception of possibilities, and of transformation of one of them into reality. Adherents of mechanistic determinism believe that all that exists is fully predetermined by the past, just as the future is predetermined by the present. That means that everything is given at once, that the future may be read in the present. But if all the possibilities were given once and for all, and no new possibilities could arise in development, the world would be threatened with exhaustion of possibilities, and it would be much like the familiar figure in Balzac's La Peau de Chagrin, whose days and hours melted away with each wish that was fulfilled. But development is not just an unfolding of the scroll of ready-made possibilities. Just as there is something more in the consequence than there was in the cause, so in reality ever new possibilities are constantly born. The kinds of possibilities. For a possibility to become reality, two factors are necessary: the operation of a certain law and the availability of appropriate conditions. As everything in the world, possibilities develop, some of them grow, others wither away. In nature, possibility is on the whole turned into reality objectively, independently of the subject. In social life, too, events may sometimes occur of themselves, as it were, some possibilities, which are in keeping with the fundamental laws of social being, are realized independently of us. But history is made by people. And that means that a great deal depends on their will and consciousness. In these troubled days, mankind faces the problem of war and peace, a problem whose importance it is impossible to exaggerate. Mankind's continued existence depends on the solution of that problem. It is possible to rid the world of nuclear nightmares and to save the planet. There is no fatal inevitability of a world war. This possibility is an active real force, and all the conditions exist for this possibility becoming factual reality. The rise of mass democratic and anti-war movements has significantly expanded and strengthened the vast potential of reason and goodwill. 174 The most essential characteristic of possibility is the measure of its potential. Depending on the force of necessity underlying them, possibilities may be promising, they may hold little promise, or no promise at all, being mere formalities. A real or promising possibility is a law-governed tendency in the object's development connected with an objective necessity. A possibility of little promise is an inessential tendency in the object's development which becomes a reality only under a definite contingency. It is, as it were, a possibility suspended in the air. A formal possibility differs from impossibility, from that which is fundamentally impossible, which cannot be realized under any conditions. It is impossible, for instance, to meet Socrates in the street. We can only speak of a possibility when the real existence of that whose possibility is asserted by us does not contain anything impossible. A vast mass of formal possibilities is never transformed into reality because they are governed by chance, not necessity. At the same time, a quite real possibility may be wasted or unrealized in view of some circumstances. It then becomes a formal possibility. But a formal possibility can also become a real one. For example, the possibility of man's flight in space was only recently formal, but now it has become a reality. Or consider the transplantation of the organs of the human body. Would it have been possible in the times of Hippocrates? Before it becomes a reality, a formal possibility must turn into a real one. In the presence of antithetic determining factors and polar possibilities, a given real possibility may be reduced to zero. It sometimes also happens that possibilities cancel each other out. A scientific understanding of the correlation between possibility and reality differs from the fatalistic notion, which identifies possibility with necessity. A real possibility is not seen as an inevitability but as a process that presupposes the influence of chance, deviations and the struggle of opposing forces. Not everything that is necessary is possible precisely at the given moment. The idea of probability. The concept of probability occupies a special place in the complex tangle of links between necessity and chance, which, as we know already, are different modes of the transformation of the possible into the real and thus a kind of measure for the possibility of the occurrence of a given event. This concept is linked with statistical laws of being as opposed to its dynamic laws covered by the concept of necessity. 175 The concept of probability, familiar from antiquity, attracted a close attention of various thinkers in the 17th century, and it was first used in the theory of gambling to calculate the degree of probability of certain moves in a game. Until the end of the 19th century, scientists were mostly concerned with the mathematical aspects of statistical processes. Later, researchers became more and more concerned with the concrete implementation of statistical probabilistic laws in various spheres of life, first in the world of social events, disease statistics, crime statistics, etc., and later in the natural sciences. The most triumphant achievement of probabilistic methods was the founding of quantum physics, in which the idea of probability reached to the inmost essence of being. So, what is probability? Probability is a measure of objective possibility, a degree of possible realization of a given event in given conditions and under a given law. It characterizes the degree to which a certain possibility is grounded, the measure of its ability to become reality, the degree of its closeness to realization, the correlation of favorable and negative factors. Probability indicates the degree to which a certain event is possible or in general impossible. The probability of some possibility is a number in the interval between 0 and 1. Between these two extreme poles lies a scale of various degrees of probability. A certain scholar carried out the following experiment. He tossed a coin 24,000 times, and recorded 12,012 cases of heads and 11,988 of tails. It is said in such cases that the probability of a coin falling heads or tails up equals 0.5. Probability is thus a property of multitudes of events. For a small number of tosses, and still less for a single toss, it is impossible to predict the result. Chance reigns here completely. Its power, though, is limited by a statistical law. When the number of tosses reaches a sufficiently high value, both possibilities are realized with identical necessity. The coin is symmetrical, and that is the main cause of equally probable result. If the probability of an event is infinitesimal, we ignore it. Thus we can sit and listen to a lecture without fear that a meteorite will fall on our head. A 100% probability is necessity. The absence of any probability is complete unlikelihood and even impossibility of events. Probability relations have two aspects: the internal, connected with the object's structure. In the example cited above, it is the symmetric structure of the coin, and the external, connected with the frequency of the event, in our example, the number of tosses. 176. The objective link between the internal and the external aspect of probability is expressed in the law of large numbers, which states that the total effect of a large number of accidental factors leads, under certain very general conditions, to a result virtually independent of chance. Each event is the resultant of necessary and accidental causes. The law of large numbers acts as the law of stable causes overcoming the influence of accidental causes. Constancy is manifested within the confines of the conditions and causes that produce a certain phenomenon. In the example cited here, as the number of experiments increases, the principal cause, the coin's symmetry, makes itself felt, acting constantly in the same direction and ultimately leading to the realization of both possibilities. Given a great number of tests, the frequency remains almost constant for a series of chance events. That was what made scientists assume the existence of laws and phenomena occurrence that do not depend on the researcher. A statistical law manifested in a mass of individual events, with its specific relationship between the necessary and the accidental, the individual and the general, the whole and its parts, cause and effect, the possible and the probable, constitutes the objective basis on which the mighty building of the statistical methods of the scientific study of the world is erected. The methods of the theory of probability, and the statistical methods directly connected with them, acquire an ever greater importance in all the areas of contemporary science. Absolute elimination of probability from cognition is impossible owing to the immutable fact that probability in our knowledge expresses real probabilistic properties of possibilities. What does the special meaning of probabilistic concepts consist in? With the aid of these concepts, it is possible to give a new interpretation of traditional philosophical problems. The relationship between chance and necessity, possibility and reality. Earlier, chance was fairly often interpreted as an event whose cause was, for the time being, unknown to man, that is to say, it was actually identified with necessity, and possibility, as depending on the extent of our knowledge of the world. With the introduction of the concept of probability, the situation was changed drastically. Probability has ceased to be a purely epistemological concept reflecting the extent of our knowledge of the object, and become an ontological concept reflecting the objective essence of the object itself. Thus in classical mechanics, given precise knowledge of the initial conditions and the forces applied, it is possible to determine unambiguously the position of any element after any period of time. Here, dynamic laws obtain, which basically contain unambiguous necessity, whereas in quantum mechanics the values of physical magnitudes are only determined statistically, and the dependence of these magnitudes on unambiguously determined wave functions is probabilistic. Here, statistical laws obtain, which basically contain a series of probabilistic magnitudes. probability is not a consequence of subjective ignorance but is an objective attribute of being itself. 177. The introduction of probabilistic attributes among the ontological characteristics of being itself does not at all mean that the subject of cognition is completely eliminated from probabilistic theories. On the contrary, it was quantum mechanics based on statistical probabilistic methods that raised with particular acuteness one of the most interesting problems, that of combining in scientific theory both the object of knowledge and the knowing subject. Scientific concepts are not mere mirror-like reflections of the object of reality. Each of them contains semantic nuances which are determined by the purely human mode of cognition, by the forms of man's sensuous perception and thought. There is no science that would offer us an unambiguous image of reality. There is always a certain subjectiveness in the system of its concepts and judgments. Any concept, even purely ontological at first sight, such as object, cell or matter, contains epistemological elements. The concept of probability, just as all the categories of dialectics, combines a degree of subjective confidence in the appearance of events, the epistemological aspect, and a measure of an event's subjective possibility, the ontological aspect. 6. Part and whole. System. The historical solution of the problem of the relationship between the categories of part and whole. If the idea of probability, which has made itself felt only in recent decades, enriches our understanding of the dialectics of the necessary and the accidental, the system's approach, also a child of the 20th century, is a result of an in-depth consideration of the traditional dialectical problems connected with the categories of whole and its parts, and with the relationship between these categories. On the most general plane, the clarification of the relationship between the whole and its parts has traditionally assumed the solution of such questions as, 1. Is the whole a sum of its parts or something qualitatively different? 2. What precedes what, the part the whole or the whole the part? 3. What is the connection between the whole and its parts, and also between these parts within the whole? Is this connection causal? 4. Is the whole cognized through the parts, or can the parts be cognized only on the basis of knowledge of the whole that comprises them? Until the recent spreading of the system's approach, all these fundamental questions were solved either on the mechanical summative approach or on the idealist disintegrative approach. 178. The explanatory principle of mechanical summation primarily developed in the framework of materialist theories oriented towards classical mechanics, in which the whole was seen above all as an ensemble of its parts differing but little from their simple sum. To know the whole meant to know the parts of the whole. This answer to the first and the fourth of the above questions unambiguously entailed corresponding answers to the two others. Parts were regarded as preceding the whole, and the whole was therefore understood as causally conditioned by its parts. The idealistic integrative principle of explanation, which goes back to Socrates and Plato, insisted, on the contrary, on the priority of the whole. The whole was seen not as a sum of its parts but as a unity qualitatively different from the sum which precedes its parts. The idealist basis of this version is obvious here, and is in no causal dependence on them. From this position, to know parts adequately, it is necessary first to know the whole comprising them. The first principle exaggerated the role of parts and reduced the whole to their sum. This was a reflection of the metaphysical nature of materialism in the 16th to 19th centuries, whereas the second, being basically idealistic and at the same time dialectical, such was the history of the formation of materialist dialectics, stressed the idealist aspect of being so strongly that it recognized integrity as a property of objects of spiritual activity only. The adherents of this principle saw the material world as an unordered and chaotic pile of dead aggregates. The merits of these two explanatory principles, the materialism of the first and the dialectics of the second, were combined in dialectical materialism and in the systems approach that gradually took shape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So what is the modern view of the problem of relationship between the whole and its parts? The dialectics of the whole and its parts. Let us try to answer the four questions raised in the above from dialectical materialist positions. 179. Question 1. How are the part and the whole related to each other? The whole is a unity of its parts that has new qualities not deducible from the parts constituting it. Let us consider a molecule of water. That is an example of a relatively simple system. By itself, hydrogen, of which two atoms form part of this system, burns, and oxygen, of which one atom forms part of the system, boosts combustion. But the system consisting of these elements has brought to life quite a different, integrative property. Water extinguishes fire. The atoms of all the chemical elements, forming molecules and becoming elements of such systems as the organs and other structures of the organism of man, acquire new integrative, that is, dependent on the whole that comprises them, properties which raise the structural organization of matter to a different level. It was Socrates who noticed that the face integrates its parts, the lips, the mouth, the nose, the eyes, the ears, the chin, the cheeks, into a single whole. However different the form and function of all the parts of the face might be, and however similar they might be, in themselves they do not yet form a face. A face is something integral, something whole. It cannot be divided into or reduced to those parts of which it consists without losing its qualitative definiteness as a face. It unites the parts, it comprises all of them and forms a unique whole with new integrative properties. In bisexual biological species, no one separate creature can produce offspring without the participation of an individual of the opposite sex, and that offspring is not a mere sum of previously disjoint properties but a consequence of their integral combination. Thus the whole is an entity that is not reducible to a mere sum of its constituents. So what is the relationship between a whole and its parts? The whole is more stable than its parts. In relation to them, it functions as a kind of frame with a rather great relative stability. However, the whole is not eternal, either, being an expression of relative stability of existence, it is not at the same time an absolutely immutable entity. The principle of development contains precisely the idea of qualitative shifts in stable integral structures, whereas the fluidity of the parts of a whole, their material instability and constant changes in their substantive composition are not attributes of development but merely indications of changes taking place in nature. Thus the constant changeability of the material composition of one and the same individual within a biological species, i.e. the successive replacement of some parts of a whole, does not lead to biological development, whereas the emergence of a new type of organism through adaptation processes and various mutations, i.e. a change of the whole, is an indication of development expressed in the emergence of a new biological species. 180. Is any agglomeration of phenomena something integral? It is not. Where no integrative quality is born, there is no whole, rather, There is an unordered and accidental sum of objects united by spatial juxtaposition only, a pile of stones, a crowd of people in the street. In really integral groups of phenomena there is a gradation of the degrees of integrity of its own, coinciding with the levels of structural organization of matter, with forms of its motion. Thus there is the mechanical type of integrity, as illustrated by any machine, such as clockwork. It is not just an unordered sum of parts, we have here a definite principle, and the mechanism works precisely according to this principle, to which the work of all its parts is subordinated. The mechanical type of integrity comprises all the natural systems whose principles are studied by mechanics, for example, the movement of planets round the sun. Higher types of integrity are complex physical structures, such as atoms, molecules, or crystals, as well as chemical, geological, biological and, finally, social and spiritual structures. In such high types of integrity, each part absorbs, as it were, the aroma of the real whole, the whole permeates its parts, it is present in them, in their substance, energy, and information. Thus a joke is tragically colored in a tragic context. Here, the whole affects the part in a meaningful way. In different speech contexts, one and the same word changes its meaning. The concept of part thus expresses an object not by itself but only in its relation to the whole of which it is a composing element and in which it realizes its potential. Yet another characteristic feature of the higher forms of integrity is self-development and self-reproduction of the parts. The parts of the whole if separated from it not just lose some of their essential properties but cannot in general exist in the given qualitative definiteness. The head is only a head because it is capable of thinking. And it can only think as part not just of the organism, but also of society, its history and culture. An organic whole is not formed through uniting the available parts, like the organs which were believed to be floating in the air by Empedocles, heads, eyes, ears, hands, legs, hair, hearts, etc. An organic whole is born and dies together with its parts, taking shape as an integral whole divided within itself into parts. Thus extremely complex chemical combinations forming the basis of life, the proteins and the nucleic acids, have taken shape as constituent parts of living systems and cannot exist outside them in inorganic nature. The normal functioning of living systems requires chemical integrity of the constituent combinations. For example, disruptions in the DNA structure lead to genetic consequences ranging from mutations producing terrible deformities to the death of the organism. 181 The highest form of expression of integrity is society in its history. The general laws of the social whole determine the essence of any of its parts and the direction of its development. A part behaves in accordance with the essence of the whole, and this behavior is determined by the entire system of the effective social norms, legal, moral and others. It is clear from this that the question of what precedes what, whether the part precedes the whole or vice versa, was metaphysical in its very essence, as was noted already by Hegel. The question of precedence can only arise if the whole is interpreted idealistically as something preceding the origin of matter in general, as a source and/or prototype. If the categories of part and whole are equally interpreted ontologically as attributes of being itself, neither the parts, as parts of the given whole, pre-exist the whole nor the whole pre-exists its parts, nor both exist outside each other. The categories of whole and part are thus correlative, they only have meaning in correlation with each other, and this correlation is in the nature of simultaneity, which cancels the question of precedence of either the parts or the whole. This correlative nature of the categories of part and whole, which stresses their simultaneity, also prompts the answer to the third of the questions formulated above, on the character of the connection between the whole and its parts, and also between these parts within the whole. Does this connection have a causal character? Does the nature of the whole follow from the nature of the parts, as we observe in causal genetic dependence? It is a well-known fact that systems function on the principle of symmetric interdependence, which is called in science the principle of functional correlation. Not one part can change without other parts also being changed, and this change is synchronic in character. The feedback obtaining in a systemic whole ensures the stability of the whole within the given qualitative definiteness. Along with correlation, systemic wholes are also subject to subordination connections reflecting the complex inner structure of the system, in which some parts may be inferior to others in their importance, and subordinated to them in the common cause of uniting all the elements in a single whole. Expressing a type of connection between phenomena that are on the whole coexistent, correlation and subordination do not at all negate the principle of determinism, and causal genetic determinism in particular, which in this case appears as mediated by other systems' principles, in view of which its action can be expressed in the form of correlative dependences, which conceal the causal connection. 182 Finally, let us answer the fourth question, about the epistemological significance of the categories of whole and part. What is cognized through what, the whole through its parts or the parts through the whole? Here, too, there is a dialectic of a special sort. The parts and the whole are cognized simultaneously. Isolating the parts, we study them at once not as individual phenomena taken by themselves but as parts of a given whole. At the same time, as we study the whole, we bear in mind its dividedness into parts. There is no whole without the parts, and there are no parts without the whole. The whole is a unified but divided integral entity. In studying a whole we isolate through analysis corresponding parts in it and establish the character of their connection. However, it is not enough to study the parts outside their links with the whole. He who knows only the parts does not yet know the whole. Thus a separate frame in a film can only be really understood as an element of the picture as a whole. On the other hand, an abundance of particulars may eclipse the whole. That is a characteristic feature of empiricism. The question of the epistemological significance of the categories of part and whole is most important methodologically, since it permits an adequate interpretation of the principle of reduction, of the complex to the elementary, so that to avoid the extremes of reductionism. This became especially necessary in connection with the development of molecular biology, in which the principle of reduction manifested both its heuristic fruitfulness and the limitations of its applicability. Reductionism is by no means monolithic, it has varied forms, but in all cases one ought to see its limitations and the need for passing on towards integrativeness, i.e. to the system's approach, as a way of reconstructing disrupted integrity. Reductionism may assume correct forms when it knows what it seeks, whether it is the laws themselves of physical realities embodied in biological structures or the essence of the whole through the clarification of its parts. What is important here is the scientist's goal. The image of the whole is invariably present in scientific research, artistic creativity, or the working out of a political strategy, as a preliminary premise, as the beginning which, passing through many stages of detailed analysis, will revert upon itself but with a richer interpretation of its particular content. 183 Whole and System. The complexities and nuances of the dialectics of whole and part are reflected in a particular way in the system's approach, which is applied practically in all the areas of knowledge. But the concept of system is not identical to that of whole, or vice versa. Whole and part remain properly philosophical categories with a rich history and a special semantic load. The concept of system has currency in all the sciences, it has a strong natural scientific flavor and has not therefore become so far part of the principal categories of dialectics. There are various interpretations of the relationship between the concepts of system and whole. They are now seen as genus and species, now as mere synonyms, and now as reflection of different aspects of the being of one and the same object. Thus the view is expressed that the whole is a system at its height, as distinct from systems that are barely organized or already disintegrating. Only the future can show the fate of these concepts. The concept of system may oust the category of whole, or both may occupy their places at the corresponding levels of the semantic and categorial structure of human thought. 7. Content and form. The history of the formation of the categories of content and form. We shall end our discussion of the categories of dialectics that have not yet been embodied in a clearly formulated law with the categories of content and form. Their special complexity is due to the fact that they stand in extremely subtle relations to the other categories, especially those of essence and phenomenon, the individual and the general, whole and part. At first sight, this pair of categories is the same as the internal and external characteristics of objects. It all would appear to be quite simple. In reality, however, the apparent simplicity stops short of the status of the category of content, the leading member of this pair. Does it have meaningful filling only, or is it an objective attribute of being? Do we have to look for content as opposed to form in a crystal, apart from essence opposed to phenomenon, or parts and the integrative wholeness, or its individual and general properties? What is the difference, then, between essence and content, phenomenon and form? It is so complex and ambiguous that essence is often defined in terms of content and vice versa. To sort this problem out, let us turn to the history of the formation of these categories. It was Aristotle who worked out in detail the category of form and endowed it with the meaning that had been attached to it for 2,000 years but now is entirely different from our contemporary interpretation of form. 184 Now, how did Aristotle interpret form? For him, it was an ideal principle existing outside matter. Imposed on matter, form lent a thing a concrete image. Considered outside matter, forms had a hierarchy of their own. Thus God was a form of all forms. Matter designated a constant and immutable substratum of all the transient and changeable phenomena. It occupied the place of contemporary content, and the pair of correlated concepts was form, matter. Naturally, form interpreted in this way was associated with the essence of a thing, with its idea, Plato, as well as with the concept of the general. This conception of form suited medieval theology well, too, because of its interpretation of God as the form of all forms. In the argument between the realists and the nominalists, in which the concepts of essence and the general were crystallized, form occupied the same place as essence and the general, with the difference that, unlike the latter, it was accessible to sensuous perception. It was this last element in the interpretation of form, i.e. it's linked not only with the essence of a thing but also with phenomenon, not just with the general but also with the concrete and individual, that led to the category of form gradually losing its ties with the ideal first principle of the world and being used as an attribute of matter itself. The ideal was now associated only with being not perceived sensuously, and was therefore embodied in the categories of essence and the general, not to mention theological terminology. Things came to be thought of as possessing form by themselves, and this form no longer coincided with the idea or essence of a thing. Kant separated the categories of essence and phenomenon from those of idea and matter, and Francis Bacon performed a similar operation on the category of form, asserting the primacy of matter over form and their unity in a concrete thing. While the essence of a thing, even perceived materialistically, was seen as concealed from the sensuous perception, the form of a thing was in this sense coming closer to phenomenon, losing the status of the essence of the thing, of its meaningful content. In this way the category of form, ceasing to be the ideal first principle of the world, a universal meaningfully organizing principle, became an attribute of substantively organized matter. A new correlative category was therefore needed which would take the vacant place and designate the object's essence. The category of matter was apparently unfit for this role. 185 The category of matter, apportioned a strictly defined position vis-à-vis that of idea, gradually disappeared from the system of categories connected with the concept of form, giving place to the evolving category of content. Kant introduced the categories of form and content to describe the process of thinking. What we think about is content, and the way we think and speak of it is form. Hegel, in his turn, asserted the category of content as eliminating the antithesis of form and matter. According to Hegel, content embraces both the material of a thing and its form. In reflecting the objective world, we do not see the material substratum of a thing separately from its form. They are both given to us from the outset in their unity, which is precisely what is called content. But both Kant and Hegel saw the category of content as a purely epistemological concept and not as an objective characteristic of being. Yet purely epistemological, just as purely ontological, categories are an impossibility. In each of them a synthesis of both is inevitable, although attention may of course be focused either on the one or on the other. In the category of content, the epistemological element apparently prevails, but its ontological status must also be clearly defined. Such a deeper understanding of the category of content was achieved in dialectical materialism. The concepts of content and form. Accepting the extreme importance of the epistemological antithesis of the concepts of content and form, dialectical materialism also revealed their ontological status. Content is not seen here as a formless material substratum, as in antiquity and the Middle Ages, or an epistemological concept eliminating the difference between the material of a thing and its form, but as the inner processes, inherent in the thing, which on the one hand organize the mutual relations of the elements forming the substratum and therefore have a direct bearing on the essence of the thing, and on the other are expressed, in their totality, in the thing's visible shape. The content of an object is very concrete. It embraces the entire ensemble of its elements, i.e. the material, energy, information, statistical, and dynamic elements, as well as all the real connections and relations within the framework of that object. In complex objects, content is many-sided, effectually passing into infinity, for the properties of the object pertaining to its content are infinite. They are variously manifested depending on the other objects with which the given one interacts. Content comprises the essential and the secondary, the law-governed and the accidental, the possible and the real, the external and the internal, the old and the new. So how is content to be defined in view of all this? 186. Content is the identity of all the elements and moments of the whole with the whole itself. It is the composition of all the elements of the object in their qualitative definiteness, interaction, and functioning, the unity of the object's properties, processes, relations, contradictions and trends of development. It is not all that the object contains that constitutes its content. For instance, it would be meaningless to include under the heading of content of an organism the atoms that form the molecules which in their turn form the cells. You will never know what a dove is if you thoroughly study each cell of its organism under an electronic microscope, and neither will you realize the fascination of the pictures in the Louvre or the Hermitage if you subject each of them to chemical analysis. Content-forming elements are the parts of a whole. In other words, they are elements which mark the limit of the object's divisibility in the framework of the given qualitative definiteness. The canvas cannot therefore be included in the content of a picture, and machines, in the content of social life, although neither is possible without them. The content of an organism is not simply the sum total of its organs but something more, the whole actual process of its life activity taking place in a definite form. The content of society is the entire wealth of the material and non-material life of the people functioning in it and making up that society, all the products and instruments of their activity. Having thus defined content as the identity of the components of the whole with the whole itself, let us now pass on to form. What is form? When we perceive, and conceive, a certain object, we separate it from the surrounding background, thus fixing in our mind its external form. In the sense of external shape, the form of an object is expressed in the category of boundary. The boundary, indicating the difference of given content as a whole from everything else, is precisely the external form of the object. It expresses the given object's connection with others. Besides, the category of form is also used in the sense of mode of content's expression and existence. Here we are dealing with internal rather than external form. Internal form is connected with the object's qualitative definiteness, the latter being interpreted here not as a material substratum, stone, metal, wood, etc., but as a certain meaningful formedness pointing to a mode of operation involving the object and determining the mode of its perception and incorporation in a system of a given intellectual and practical sphere. 187. Internal form is sometimes interpreted in such a way that it coincides with structure. In a certain sense, structure is inner organization, but the description, or rather definition, description, given above shows clearly, we hope, that the concepts of form and structure cannot be regarded as identical. If we consider the above definition of content and interpretation of internal form, we shall notice precisely at this point that these concepts are almost identical, so that form indeed emerges as a mode of expression of content identical with it. The fact that the one is manifested in and through the other actually brings us into the sphere of dialectical interconnection of these concepts. The dialectics of content and form. Form and content are different poles of one and the same entity, and not component parts. Their unity is revealed in the fact that a given content is arrayed in a definite form. In zero gravity, for instance, a liquid left to itself takes the form of a ball, the most advantageous relation between a body's surface and volume. processes of life of qualitatively different content gave rise to a great many extremely complex forms of plants and animals. The content of biochemical, energy and information processes comes to life as a well-proportioned organism only when it assumes a definite form. The way something is organized depends on what is organized. Form is determined by content itself, not by some extraneous force. Each form disappears along with its content, to which it corresponds and from which it originates. The dialectics of form and content assumes their relative independence, with content being in the dominant position. Abstraction of form from content can never be absolute, for there are no pure forms indifferent to content. Each change in form is a reflection of transformations in content, in the object's inner links. Unfolding in time, this process is implemented through a contradiction expressed in form lagging behind content, i.e. in the existence of a state of the system in which a new content does not have an adequate new form retaining instead an old one associated with the content that has already outlived its usefulness. The contradiction is expressed here in the difference in the orientation of these elements of an integral whole, and is always resolved through the breaking down of the old form and the emergence of a new one. Both nature and society are dominated by the principle of given content rejecting form that no longer corresponds to it, and of given form rejecting content that no longer suits it. This is a mutual process, and it is observed in anything that develops through the struggle of its sides, as graphically illustrated by obsolete modes of thought, dogmas, clichés, and stereotypes inherent both in everyday and scientific thinking, lagging behind content, behind the motion of real life. 188 Wisdom is a matter of not letting out of sight either the meaningful or the formal aspect of an object. This is especially important in social practice. An inability to balance on the crest of the wave of the dialectics of form and content is in this area fraught with the danger of extremely negative consequences. Indeed, the danger of slipping down from the dialectical level is objectively rooted in the fact that only through knowledge of the form of things and processes can one go deep into their content and sort out the infinite diversity of the manifestations of essence. That is why form is often taken for the essence. The metaphysical gap between form and content produces, for instance, such a distorted form of organization in the sphere of management as bureaucratism. Form must not be raised to an absolute, that is clear, but it is just as unjustified to ignore it. A bad organizational form may discredit even the most brilliant of ideas. 8. Quality, quantity and measure. The concepts of quality, property and state. Let us ask ourselves this question: is a given thing different from some other thing in some respect? If we think that the given thing is no different from any other, it is impossible to speak of our knowledge of that thing. If we know what a given thing is, then it is something for us. And if it is something, that means that it is the sum total of certain properties. A vase is something made of glass. It is a receptacle for flowers. As such, it has color, form and the texture of the material of which it is made. The sum total of all of these properties of the vase is its quality. Clearly, if we do not perceive this thing as something integral, we shall be unable to distinguish a vase, say, from a rose, or a table from a chair. Yet we fully understand what a vase is, what its structure and purpose are. Therefore, if we really know something as a vase, we have a knowledge of its quality, its definiteness and separation from the surrounding background. The quality of a thing points to a totality of its properties, its composition and structure, its functional purpose both in interaction with other things and with the knowing subject. In other words, the quality of a thing is something essential for its knowledge, for its practical application and manufacture. It is the aspect that permits the differentiation of one thing from another, and thus the identification, opposition, comparison, combination, division, and generally construction of things not only in being, in practice, but also in consciousness. By operating with the category of quality we superimpose, as it were, one object on another, which acts as an instrument for the identification of an object with itself and enables us to know that the given object is precisely this and not something else. Here, the previously unknown object appears as a known one. A flying object is recognized as a bird, and not just a bird but a dove, and not just a dove but a dove of a certain sort. 189 The quality of an object is revealed in the totality of its structurally ordered properties. From the epistemological standpoint, a property is a primary, further indivisible structure correlated with just as elementary cognitive phenomenon of sensation, and in more complex cases, with concept, if it is inaccessible to the subject's capacity for sensation. Properties can be accessible to the sense organs or physically accessible to measurement by apparatus, and they can also be extrasensuous, pertaining to the sphere of social mental reality, characterizing for instance a person's positive or negative qualities to which we refer in such terms as a sensitive conscience or kind soul. They are known through interaction of objects with one another and with the subject. A property is thus a way of manifestation of the object's definite aspects in relation to other objects with which it interacts. A property is precisely that through which something manifests its specific being in relation to something else. Among all possible properties, we can single out properties essential, or necessary, and inessential, accidental, for the given object, and also internal and external, universal and specific, natural and artificial ones. The sum total of properties taken as a whole, as a system, forms the object's qualitative definiteness, reflecting its aspects of integrality and relative stability. Quality is an existing definiteness, the expression of the stable unity of an object's elements and structure. Properties are manifested with various degrees of intensity, and this expresses the state of the system involved. The state is a stable manifestation of a given property in its dynamic. We speak of the physical, psychical, or moral state of a person or a people, of the state of a given nation's economy, or of its political or military state. The object's other properties are addressed to the outside, while its state is turned towards its inner structure. Properties, states, functions and connections are an object's qualitative features. 190 Having established what property and state are, we can tackle a fuller definition of the quality of an object. Quality is an integral description of the functional unity of an object's essential properties, its internal and external definiteness, its relative stability. The mode of manifestation of the quality of a given object in its impact on another object essentially depends on the latter's qualitative state. Thus a spark falling on a gunpowder store is much more dangerous than the same spark falling on damp ground. The organs of a plant with their different properties take different positions in response to an identical environmental factor, say light. The tops of the shoots curve towards light while the leaves take up a position perpendicular to the direction of the rays. But the mode of manifestation of the quality of a given object also depends on the conditions of interaction with other objects. Consider the interaction between earth and water. Under definite temperatures, water seeps into the earth as rain, while under higher temperatures it evaporates from the earth's surface. Under certain conditions, the interacting objects themselves change their qualitative state. Properties do not just manifest themselves, they may also be modified and even shaped in these relations. Any property or quality of an object interacting with other objects is relative. Steel is hard in relation to wood but soft in relation to a diamond. Any of the object's qualitative states is relative. A given qualitative state may disappear under different conditions, but it only disappears by being transformed into another. Possessing an ensemble of properties which constitute its quality, an object manifests different aspects of that quality in different contexts. For example, the doctor, the lawyer, the writer, the sociologist, the anatomist, the psychologist all observe different qualitative facets of the human being. Just as matter is irreducible to a set of its properties, so no object is dissolved into its properties, it is their carrier or substratum. The higher the level of the organization of matter in an object, the greater the number of qualities and properties it possesses. The concept of quantity. Every group of homogeneous objects is a set. If the set is finite, it can be counted. Suppose we have a herd of 100 cows. In order to see a separate cow as one, we must ignore all the qualitative peculiarities of every animal. One and the same number 100 is a quantitative characteristic of any set of 100 objects, whether it be cows, books or diamonds. One may subject to quantitative comparison both qualitatively homogeneous things and those that differ qualitatively in one respect but are similar in others, say, in weight, hardness, or in terms of division of an object into parts. Thus a quantity is a set if it can be counted, and a magnitude if it can be measured. Quantity expresses the external, formal relationship between objects, their parts, properties and connections, number, magnitude, volume, set, class, or degree of manifestation of a given property. The concepts of number, magnitude, figure, etc., are aspects or elements of the category of quantity. 191 In order to establish an object's quantitative definiteness, we compare its constituent elements, spatial extent, rate of change, degree of development, with a definite standard as a unit of computation and measurement. The greater the complexity of a phenomenon, the more difficult it is to study it in terms of quantitative methods. It is far from easy to count and measure, say, phenomena in the sphere of morality, politics or aesthetic perception. It is no accident therefore that knowledge of quality precedes that of quantitative relations. An understanding of the quantitative aspect of a system is a step towards a deeper knowledge of the whole system. Before counting, one must know what one is going to count. Science moves from general qualitative evaluations and descriptions of phenomena towards the establishment of exact quantitative laws. The basis of quantitative thinking is the objective discreteness of things and processes. Quantity is expressed by number, which contains two basic meanings: the measure of generality, of membership in the same order of discrete elements juxtaposed with one another, and of the dividedness, real or putative, of an object, of its properties and relations, into homogeneous elements relatively independent of its quality. The number 5 expressing For instance, a set of 5 persons is not something fused and indivisible, not just an instance of oneness, but a specifically divisible unity of qualitatively homogeneous 5 units. Any number is a relatively independent, integral assembly of a certain set, or a divisible unity of quantity. This quantity is not identical to number, one and the same quantity as a magnitude. For example, extent and measuring length may be expressed in different scales of measurement, say, in meters or centimeters, and therefore in different numbers. Number is a conceptual form of assimilation of an object's quantitative definiteness. Measure. Any quality is expressed in a system of quantitative characteristics that is inherent in this quality. Quantity and quality appear as something separate only in abstraction, while in effect they are different characteristics of definite realities, gravitating towards each other and existing as an indissoluble unity that is their measure. 192 Measure is a sort of third term that links quality and quantity in a single whole. For example, labor productivity as measure has 2 aspects: the quality of labor and its productiveness, the quantity of the product produced. If we compare labor productivity in industry before and after the scientific and technical revolution, the measure of dependence of labor's quantitative characteristics on improvement of its quality will become very clear indeed. On the other hand, we know from physics that atoms of various chemical elements differ from one another only in the number of protons in their nuclei. The moment the number of protons in the nucleus is changed, one element is transformed into another. It is not enough to say, though, that measure is the unity of quality and quantity, and that it is the boundary at which quality is manifested in its definiteness. Measure is profoundly connected with essence, with law and regularity. Ch6 Measure is the zone within which a given quality is modified and varied in keeping with changes in the quantity of individual and essential properties while retaining its essential characteristics. The transformation of quantity into quality. The path of development in nature, society and consciousness is by no means a straight line. Its turns and twists are the nodes of ever-new laws whose rides stretch from one node to the next. It is a nodal line of measures. The boundaries of these measures are not always clearly fixed, and sometimes they are tentative, say, as the boundaries separating childhood from adolescence or youth from maturity, determined by anatomic, physiological, psychical, and social factors. The process of development presents a unity of the continuous and the discrete. Continuous changes, i.e. gradual quantitative changes, and the changes of separate properties in the framework of a given quality closely connected with them, are designated by the concept of evolution. In a broader sense, however, this concept is applied to designate the development of systems of global order. For example, evolution of the stars, of the plant and animal kingdoms, as well as of man himself. 193 Continuity in the development of a system expresses its relative stability and qualitative definiteness, and discreteness, a transition to a new quality. As water is heated, it remains water, albeit hot or very hot. That means that some of its properties have changed, the velocity of the motion of its molecules has grown. This change is gradual, and it proceeds in phases. But then the critical boiling point comes, molecules of water moving at frenzied speeds rise in clouds to the surface as steam. Water passes from the liquid state into steam. 6 Apart from the one given here, the concept of measure is also used in other senses, in the sense of proportionality of parts within a whole, optimum, of the boundary of the permitted, of gracefulness, or freely organized harmony and rhythm in motion, and of a unit of measurement, for example, a full measure of grain. The lifting of some element of the development of a system to an absolute is an error of metaphysics which virtually refutes the very idea of development. Indeed, it is clear that the assertion of discreteness and nothing but discreteness leads to disruption of links and interconnections, while the reverse assertion of absolute continuity excludes qualitative transitions. Systems develop rhythmically, and as the clock of the universe strikes, it marks each time the birth of the new, being a process of the transformation of quantity into quality. This process is based on gradual accumulation of quantitative changes in the system as well as gradual qualitative renovation of its structural elements. Quantitative changes are extremely varied, covering changes in the number of elements in an object, in the volume of information, the velocity of motion, and the degree of manifestation of a given quality. Any of these quantitative changes leads to the emergence of a new quality. The appearance of a new quality is in effect the emergence of a new object with new laws of life, a new measure in which a different quantitative law is embedded. The depth of qualitative changes may vary, it may be restricted to the level of the given form of motion or go beyond its limits, as illustrated by the emergence of the animate from the inanimate and of society from the primitive horde. These qualitative changes signify the formation of a new essence. The process of the formation of a qualitative state is contradictory. It is a unity of destruction and renewal, of being and non-being, of negation and assertion. It is a measure expressing the unity of quantity and quality both in relation to objects characterized by mere transformation within the given level of system organization and in relation to the boundaries of transition from one level of system organization to another. The process of radical change in a given quality, the breakdown of the old and the birth of the new is a leap, a demarcation line separating one measure from another. There are different types of leaps determined both by the nature of the developing system and by the conditions under which it develops, i.e. by the external and internal factors of development. 194 examples of gradual leaps, or leaps extended in time, in the development of objective reality are the emergence of life on Earth, the origin of man and his consciousness, the formation of new species of animals and plants, the replacement of one socio-economic formation by another, the great landmarks in the development of science, art, etc. Along with these, there have been leaps that occurred turbulently and at a great speed, leaps attended by explosions, so to speak, of which the characteristic features are clear-cut transition boundaries, great intensity, integrity of the restructuring of the entire system, its rise to a higher level of essence at one go. What happened in the universe during the Big Bang may be a good illustration of such a leap. In microprocesses, such a leap may take up a billionth of a second. There are thus two types of leap, gradual leaps and instantaneous leaps, the division resting on the time factor of their realization. In accordance with the nature of quality as a system of properties, leaps are divided into individual or particular and general. Individual leaps are connected with the emergence of new particular properties, and general leaps, with the transformation of the entire system of properties, of quality as a whole. A social revolution is a special type of leap. Its specificity lies in the fact that it is carried out consciously and purposefully, being implemented in the activities of popular masses, social groups, classes, political parties and their leaders. The character of this revolution depends on the internal and external conditions of the development of the social system, on the acuteness of the contradictions whose intensity makes it impossible for a social system to exist in its old quality. Thus the bourgeois revolutions in France and in Germany at the time of its feudal fragmentation differed considerably. A revolution as a transition from one social system to another may be realized as an explosion of the social forces, but not always in the form of an instant destruction of the old and construction of the new. As a rule, this transition unfolds in time as a process of breaking down and destroying the old and creating the new. Expressing a definite aspect of the objectively existing process of development, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality has an important methodological bearing both on theory and on practice. Its action is fairly easy to identify in nature and in the study of natural objects, but in social practice it is sometimes hard to discern with a naked eye, and thus difficult to take account of. Conscious construction of new society requires careful study of and consideration for all the principles of dialectics, including the present law, in the context of concrete historical circumstances. According to this law, to achieve a qualitative change in the system, not one measure is necessary but a number of well-directed measures or conditions for its transition to a qualitatively new state. 195-9. Contradiction and harmony, the unity of opposites and contradiction. One of the basic issues of worldview and of general methodology is the question whether the source of the world's motion and development must be sought for outside the world or in the world itself. The religious idealist worldview proceeds on the assumption that, having created the world, the supernatural force ruling it gave it an impetus and set it in motion, much like a watchmaker may produce a clock, put in a spring and wind it up. However, the scientific worldview is incompatible with such an approach. It finds impulses for the motion and development of the world in the world itself, in the contradictions inherent in reality and generated by the world, which is expressed in the universal law of dialectics, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. In accordance with that law, objective reality, the process of its cognition, and all forms of human activity develop through the division of oneness into different and opposing elements. The interaction of the opposing forces, on the one hand, marks a given system as something integral, and on the other, constitutes the inner impulse of its change and development. All concrete systems go through the test of contradiction in their life. Lenin saw the law of the unity and struggle of opposites as the nucleus or essence of dialectics. Dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects. 7. This law permits the identification of the sources, the real causes and forms of motion, and of the types of development of all being. There is no progress outside contradictions. Since time immemorial, reason has been fascinated both by the contradictions in the forms of being and by their integrity. These modes of interaction in the world, in human relations, and in the states of the soul provide key principles not only for being itself but also for the world view, and for the methodology of knowledge and action. Without them, it is impossible to understand anything in life. 196-7 V.I. Lenin, Conspectus of Hegel's book Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Collected Works, Volume 38, pages 251-52. We argue, we refute and defend things. And we do it not only in argument with others but also with ourselves, with one's alter ego. Contradiction is a definite type of interaction between different and opposing sides, properties, and tendencies within a given system or between systems, a process of confrontation between opposing tendencies and forces. The extreme case of contradiction is conflict. The history of science, art, technology, and the entire social practice shows that the fabric of the whole of the world's life is woven, as it were, out of strands of two kinds, positive and negative, the old and the new, the progressive and the reactionary, and so on. These are in confrontation and struggle with each other. The ultimate cause of the development of any system is interaction in the form of contradiction between different aspects both within an object and among objects. There are no absolutely identical things, they are different both within themselves and among themselves. Difference is a relation of non-identity, of dissimilarity within an object and between objects. Differences have their degrees, they may be either essential or inessential. An extreme expression of an essential difference is an opposite. An apt model of an opposite provided by nature itself is a magnet with its poles facing in opposite directions. We may divide the magnet into as many small parts as we like, but each of them will still have a north and a south pole, illustrating the physical opposition of the lines of force. In this sense, everything in the world may be likened to this model. Opposites may be described as mutually conditioned and interacting sides of a dialectical contradiction. They oppose each other within the framework of a single relationship. The presence of one assumes the being of another. The dialectical principle of contradiction reflects a dual relationship within the whole, a unity of opposites and their struggle. The concept of contradiction is only meaningful if the differences and opposites are considered as elements of some integral entity. The principle of contradiction assumes the existence of a unity with opposing sides. Opposites that do not form a unity or do not enter into a common relationship, are not dialectical opposites, and they cannot be regarded as a motive force of the development of a system. There are opposites differing in quality and role, such as black and white, the infinitely great and the infinitesimal, the brilliant and the primitive, which do not appear as parts of a single whole and therefore do not contain in themselves any impulse for development. Opposites may run into conflict only inasmuch as they form a whole in which one element is just as necessary as the other. 197 Signifying the stability of an object, the unity of opposites, and the opposites themselves, are relative and transient, while the struggle of ever new opposites is absolute, which is an expression of the infinity of the process of development. It is also conditioned by the fact that contradiction is not only a relationship between opposing tendencies in an object but also the object's relation to itself, its constant self-negation. Contradictions are embedded in the very essence of things as an attribute of all forms of reality, as a manifestation of the activeness of matter and spirit. They are internally inherent in life, in thought, and in emotion. That is the natural mode of existence of all the hierarchical forms of the organization of being. Knowledge moves in a constant contradiction between the inexhaustible wealth of the forces, properties and relations in the real world and the subject's desire to reproduce them as fully as possible in the system of scientific knowledge. All essential ideas in science, wrote Einstein and Enfeld, were born of a dramatic conflict between reality and our attempts to understand it. Dialectical contradiction in thought is not a contradiction in one's reasoning or absence of logic, it is interaction of conflicting positions, viewpoints, and notions. The recommendations of formal logic, including the rule against elementary contradictions in one's reasoning and against frivolous dancing from one assertion to another without any objective or logical grounds, help to elucidate the real contradictions rather than obscure them. In dialectics, it is not contradictions in man's reasoning that are at issue, although such contradictions may arise spontaneously in any intellectual quest, when mental associations go in a whirlwind round some idea, but contradictions in the object itself and reflection of these contradictions in thinking, where they are consciously fixed and resolved. A specific form of the existence of dialectical contradictions in cognition are antinomies, or theoretical reproductions of contradictions in scientific theories. The most fruitful way of resolving antinomies is overstepping the limits of their metaphysical opposition. The metaphysical method of thinking discerns in opposites only the mere fact of difference, leaving their interaction in the shadow, discovery of their common basis, clarification of the transition from one opposite to the other, identification of the mediating links of this transition and, finally, establishment of the resultant consequence to which the struggle of opposites reflected in them must lead. 198 The principal types of contradictions. The character of contradictions depends on the specifics of the opposites and on the conditions under which their interaction unfolds. This interaction is a relationship between tendencies that are either incompatible and hostile or mutually complementary and enriching. Hence the diversity of the types of contradictions. Some of them lead to harmony, others, to disharmony. There are also internal and external, principal and subsidiary, antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. Interaction between the opposite sides within a given system, for example, a given species of animals, intraspecific struggle, a separate organism or society, is characteristic of internal contradictions, which express the state of a system as a definite whole. Each system exists, of course, in the framework of hierarchically more complex wholes, but internal contradictions refer precisely to concrete systems rather than the world as a whole. It is then obvious that external contradictions are the interaction of opposites pertaining to different systems, for example, to society and nature, the organism and the environment. It is clear, of course, that the concepts of external and internal are relative. As regards the role of internal and external contradictions in development, it should be stressed that ultimately it is internal contradictions that play the decisive role. Even if the first impulse for the development of a system comes from an external contradiction, the latter must pass, in one form or another, into the inner structure of the system in order to become the true motive force of development, and only after this is development as such possible. For instance, for an organism to adapt itself to the environment, an external contradiction, it works out new qualities which form an internal contradiction with its original qualities, and this contradiction controls the organism's development. The external always acts through the internal. In the set of various internal contradictions facilitating the development of a system, principal contradictions are distinguished from secondary ones. A principal contradiction of a given system is above all an essential contradiction. It is linked with forms of interaction of opposites lying at the very base of this system and constituting its structure. For example, from the very inception of society, the source of its development has been the contradiction between production and consumption, or needs, or interests. Everyday people have to drink, eat, dress, and have a roof over their heads. For that, though, all this must be produced. Production gives rise to fresh needs, which stimulates people to introduce improvements in production. The contradiction is resolved through labor and distribution of wealth. It is not eliminated but reproduced every day and every hour, being connected with the essence of the social form of motion. In different social systems, however, the principal contradiction may appear either as antagonistic or non-antagonistic. 199 antagonistic contradictions involve interaction between implacably hostile forces, classes, social groups, etc. In society, they usually grow in acuteness until they reach the scale of a full-blown conflict, a socio-political revolution. They may be resolved through armed struggle or, sometimes, by peaceful means. Along with antagonistic contradictions and generally situations of acute conflict, there are also non-antagonistic contradictions. These contradictions involve interaction between social groups whose interests and goals basically coincide. Let us take, for example, a socialist society. The perfection of socialist society involves constant struggle of the new against the old. Not only constructive forces are in action here but also negative and sluggish ones, those that impede progress. Contradictions have come to light, for instance, in the organization of labor and the mode of distribution of wealth. Contradictions between productive forces and relations of production also grow very acute under the conditions of accelerated scientific and technological progress. Contradictions also arise in the sphere of management. The latter include contradictions between centralized management and the independence of the local organs, between the territorial and industry-oriented principles of economic management and planning, between collective and personal incentives for labor, and between forms of distribution relations. These contradictions are a natural phenomenon in any development. For example, the development itself of productive forces gave rise, at a definite stage, to the contradiction between the extensive and intensive forms of economic management. The earlier, extensive form of economic management is no longer in harmony with the new level of science and technology, raising obstacles in the way of their application and production and slowing down the process of the transformation of science into a direct productive force of society. It is not the glossing over and still less silence about real contradictions, nor the deliberate varnishing of reality to create, cost what it may, an appearance of universal prosperity and harmony, but timely identification and resolution of these contradictions that is the only rational approach to the problem in all the spheres of society's life. As we see, the vast problem of resolution of contradictions arises here. The question is, how can they be resolved? 200 Contradiction as a source of development. Contradictions of all types are realized and resolved, they are eliminated and created, they come to life in a new form, and all this constitutes their movement. The movement of contradictions towards resolution is a mode of change of the qualitative state of the system incorporating them. The root of all vitality is in contradiction as the unity and struggle of opposites. The interaction of opposites in the form of contradiction and its resolution, that is what makes a seed grow and a bud unfold into a leaf, a flower, a juicy fruit. Contradictions and their resolution set both great and small things in motion, revealing themselves in the law-governed order of the world. However, contradictions that are not resolved do not by themselves lead to development. They are a necessary but not sufficient condition for development. As a source of development, contradiction is only effective together with its resolution. In the social sphere, contradictions taken by themselves, regardless of their timely identification and effective resolution, may produce not only progressive but also regressive and destructive processes. The ways of resolving contradictions are varied. They depend on the character of the contradictions themselves as well as on the conditions of their action, including the character and level of organization of the contesting parties, especially if it is a question of contradictions in the life of man and society. In some cases one side of the contradiction in question perishes while the other triumphs, but it also happens that both sides go down in the struggle, exhausting each other. A more or less prolonged compromise between the sides is also possible, as well as their adaptation to each other and a constant revival of the apparently resolved contradiction. Resolution of contradictions may be complete or partial, instantaneous or gradual. There are two principal types of development of objects on the basis of the contradictions embedded in them, and also two principal ways of resolving of them conditioned by these types, antagonistic and non-antagonistic, or harmonious. The concept of harmony has many aspects. It implies both a desire for achieving concord, reasonable compromise, and a complete merging or coincidence on the basis of some common element, sometimes to the point of complete unity. The antagonistic type of development is marked by the overcoming of an antagonism accompanied by the death of one of the opposing sides. 201 Forming a unity, antagonistic opposites have at the same time relative independence. They are qualitatively and quantitatively unequal, they play different roles within the whole, and one of the sides is often the main motive force of development. This is clearly seen if we take the development of capitalism as our example. Proletariat and wealth are opposites, write Marx and Engels. As such they form a single whole. They are both creations of the world of private property. The question is exactly what place each occupies in the antithesis. It is not sufficient to declare them two sides of a single whole. Within this antithesis the private property owner is therefore the conservative side, the proletarian the destructive side. From the former arises the action of preserving the antithesis, from the latter the action of annihilating it. 8. Under the antagonistic type of development the conservative opposite is overcome. This principle of inequality of opposites in development is universal, it is valid everywhere where development occurs, although the character of its manifestation qualitatively varies and depends on the level of organization of matter. For instance, mutability in animate nature plays a leading role in the course of the evolution of life in relation to such a factor as heredity, which has a tendency towards preserving the qualitative definiteness of a species, thus playing a conservative role, as it were. It is a fact that our metagalaxy comprising countless galaxies is expanding, repulsion prevails over attraction here. At the same time neither heredity nor the forces of gravitation disappear completely in the resolution of the contradiction leading to the system's development. The contradiction between mutability and heredity is resolved in the harmonious type of system development in 8. Marx and F. Engels. 4. Progress Pub. Which the resolution of the given contradiction agrees with the needs for the development of the system as a whole. For instance, a living organism is unthinkable without either of the two opposites of heredity and mutability. Therefore the resolution of their contradiction is expressed in it in the form of a dynamic harmony between the two tendencies, which leads to the organism's optimal adaptation to the environment. The struggle of opposites is the motive force both in the harmonious and the antagonistic type of development. while antagonistic development is produced by antagonistic contradictions. Harmonious development is obviously associated with resolution of non-antagonistic contradictions. What is harmonious here is the type of resolution of contradictions rather than the type of contradictions themselves. Harmony is an active dynamic state of a system at the moment of resolution of non-antagonistic contradictions but not at the initial moment of confrontation between opposites which have not yet joined the struggle. In its Marxist acceptation, the principle of harmony reflects the dialectics of becoming rather than being that has already become. 202 The law of the unity and struggle of opposites, which is the nucleus of dialectics, is not only of great theoretical but also of vast practical and even practically political significance. It implies that increased acuteness of society's internal contradictions may be due not only to objective factors but also to subjective causes, untimely diagnosis and incorrect evaluation of various socio-economic, ideological and other processes and phenomena. The mastering of the law of unity and struggle of opposites develops a dialectical flexibility of thought, an acute perceptiveness for various nuances of social life. It shapes the ability for timely and adequate evaluation of favorable and unfavorable tendencies, enabling one to reject obstructions and to encourage general progress. 10. Negation. Continuity and innovation's negation as a natural element of development. Everything is finite in this world, and that means that everything goes through its spring and summer, declines towards autumn and finally dies in the frost of winter. Such is the implacable logic of life, both of nature and of everything that is human or social. Species of plants and animals, generations of men and forms of social life emerge and disappear in the infinite succession of forms that are continually born and wither away. Without negation of the old, the birth and maturing of a higher and stronger new is impossible, and thus the process of development itself is impossible. All that is the scene of struggle between mutually excluding sides and tendencies. This struggle leads to negation of the old and the emergence of the new. As it appears, a new phenomenon already carries in it its own contradictions. The struggle of opposites starts on a new basis, the need arises for a new negation, i.e. for negation of negation, ad infinitum. It is this constant negation that realizes the dialectical process of becoming of qualitative definiteness of phenomena, the replacement of some nodal lines of the measures of development by others. For instance, youth negates childhood, and in its turn is negated by maturity, and the latter, by old age. At the same time all these are different stages in the life of a single individual. This process comprises an almost imperceptible interweaving of the new with the old. While remaining what he or she was, a person becomes nevertheless different, being the seat of the extreme elements of the departing and the nascent. Thus there is both similarity and difference between the old and the new, there is coexistence and struggle, mutual negation and mutual transmutation. 203 Negation. A simple destruction of one thing by another is purely negative, it is fruitless negation which does not contain any positive shoots of the new and more progressive. Two different and even opposite types of negation have been embodied by Goethe in the immortal symbolic images of Mephistopheles and Faust. Mephistopheles negated absolutely everything and saw this negation as his very essence, while Faust negated in the name of creation, retaining elements of the old that were needed for the new. As a subjective form of manifestation of the principle of negation, critique has that meaning that it contains orientation towards the identification and resolution of contradictions, towards the assertion of the truth and rejection of errors. Such critique must fully reveal all the delusions, rather than consign them to oblivion, to be able to overcome them. If this is not done, the load of oblivion will make the critique useless, while errors that were not overcome will have a negative effect on the entire subsequent development. The value of negation is thus determined by the measure of its productiveness, by its role in the creation of the new. Negation is at the same time assertion and retention. While destroying that which exists, it retains the positive in sublated form. This retention, the unity of negation and continuity in development, is an important feature of the dialectics of negation as a universal principle of all being. Hegel illustrated this idea with a graphic example. The bud disappears when the blossom breaks through, and we might say that the former is refuted by the latter. In the same way, when the fruit comes, the blossom may be explained to be a false form of the plant's existence, for the fruit appears as its true nature in place of the blossom. These stages are not merely differentiated, they supplant one another as being incompatible with one another. But the ceaseless activity of their own inherent nature makes them at the same time moments of an organic unity, where they not merely do not contradict one another, but where one is as necessary as the other, and this equal necessity of all moments constitutes alone and thereby the life of the whole. 9204 Continuity in Development. The emergent new cannot assert itself without negation on the one hand and without retention and continuity on the other. We have development where the new interrupts the existence of the old, absorbing from it everything positive and viable. This retention of the positive is precisely the continuity in the discrete, continuity in development. Development is marked by continuity, consistency, orientation, irreversibility and retention of the results obtained. At each present moment, the world is both a fruit of the past and a seed of the future. The past cannot be regarded as disappearing without trace in the flow of time on the principle of what was has passed, and there is no return to it. It participates all the time in the creation of the present, forming a living link between epochs in the form of traditions. A tradition is a social form of the transmission of human experience. Each subsequent generation is drawn into life, into the world of objects and relations, signs and symbols created by previous generations. In the philosophical sense, a tradition is a definite type of relation between 9 Hegel, The Phenomenology of Mind, George Allen, and Unwin, London, Macmillan, New York, 1931, p. 68. Consecutive stages of a developing object, including culture, in which the old passes into the new and productively works in it, promoting its progressive development. The viable traditions are those which contain life-giving forces of creation and promote creation, acting as a necessary link in the continuity. The achievements of each generation in practical and cultural activity are a precious heritage whose growth is the result of accumulation by all preceding generations. Past grandeur still shines with the living light of the present. Hence the demand for carefully preserving it, which is a measure of culture. Careful preservation does not mean a museum-type attitude, it assumes and demands innovations which mean a progressive development of the tradition. A rationality in inheriting the traditions, combined with innovations, results in society's accelerated progressive development. Why is the link between tradition and innovation so important? The reason is that, if one does not know history, one cannot correctly understand and evaluate the present, and therefore foresee future developments, i.e. one cannot consciously act on the basis of cognized laws. 205 The progressive spiral-like nature of development. Criteria of progress. The development of matter does not follow a single path but a countless multitude of directions. It is an error to present it as a straight line. In the words of Alexander Herzen, nature in its development darts from side to side and never marches forward at a steady pace. That is exactly what conditions the infinite diversity of the forms of the existence of material bodies and phenomena. Man's evolution is only one of the lines of progress of life on the planet. The history of society also provides evidence of the extraordinary diversity of unique human cultures. Already in remote antiquity the principle was noted by astute minds that development proceeds in circular movements, with returns to the past at new levels of being. For centuries, the idea of circulation in the universe dominated the minds. It was expressed, in a profound form, in the transformations of the first elements of being, elements from which everything arises and into which everything is transformed. Here the end links up with the beginning. Recognition of circulation is also recognition of one of the really existing facets of development. But this alone is not enough, for recognition of circulation only necessarily leads to the conclusion that the world is closed, and that everything endlessly repeats itself in it. There is nothing new under the sun. This concept of development is linked with a definite understanding of time, in which the future is a mere projection of the past. This view is a crystal clear reflection of the idea of absolute predestination. The entire process of development is oriented towards the past, so that, much like a roundabout, it returns the past to the present through the future. This conception leads to the assertion that what exists now existed at some time in the past and, with things coming full circle, will exist in the future. The essence of development is given a metaphysical interpretation here. But development is not a straight line, neither is it movement in a circle. It is a spiral with an infinite number of turns. In this form, forward movement is strangely combined with circular movement. Development leads to a return, as it were, to previous stages, when some features of already outlived forms replaced by others are repeated in the new forms. This, however, is not a simple return to the original form but a qualitatively new level of development. History is a series of turns of an expanding spiral moving outwards and upwards. No subsequent cycle of development repeats the previous one, it is a new and higher level. Such is the objective orientation in the infinite succession of phenomena and processes, in the incessant struggle between the new and the old, the nascent and the withering away. Such is the dialectical path of the forward movement of being. 206 Are there any objective criteria of development, and if there are, what are they? In the first place, a general criterion of progress is perfection, differentiation and integration of the elements of a system, elementary particles, atoms, molecules, and macromolecules. Other objective criteria are a growing complexity of connections within a system and of relations between systems, a growing information content of the system in question, and an expanding range of the real possibilities of further development. All this leads to the system's growing stability and vital capacity. These criteria are common to any level of the organization of matter, and they are concretized at these levels in accordance with their specificity. Thus the criterion of progress of biological forms is the level of development of organization, Above all, the nervous system, its adaptation abilities expressed in the wealth of interrelationships between the organism and the environment, as well as the level of development of the psyche, reflection and behavioral acts. For society, this criterion is the level of development of productive forces and labor productivity, as well as the character of social relations, all of which is concentrated in a single criterion. The level of society's development is determined by the extent to which man is raised to a higher level in this society. Yet another universal criterion of progressive development is its accelerated rate. Referring to social life, Engels compared the progressive development with a freehand-drawn spiral, the turns of which are not too precisely executed. History begins its course slowly from an invisible point, languidly making its turns around it, but its circles become ever larger, the flight becomes ever swifter and more lively, until at last history shoots like a flaming comet from star to star, often skimming its old paths, often intersecting them, and with every turn it approaches closer to infinity. 10. With transition from the lower forms of organization of matter to the higher ones, the rate of development grows. The methodological significance of the law of negation consists in the fact that it offers an understanding of the direction of the development of systems and objects both of the social and the natural world, permitting a correct evaluation of the scope, possibilities and rate of that development. 10. F. Engels, Retrograde Signs of the Times, in K. Marx, F. Engels, Collected Works, Volume 2, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1975, p. 48. 200.